A date which will live in infamy.
Both
of those projects, initiatives, got off the ground because of the Ger Rebbe.
The 11 Olympic team members slain in West Germany. The Olympic Games.
Zugerecht waren Brüder in Amerika. Vertrauten Schabbat, es ist getan.
Out of the 24 who were killed were Americans who had come to learn in Kevin.
I say 1 million Jewish children who were made to be Katnusas.
Whoever heard such beautiful words?
It is never too little. It is never too late. And it is never enough.
Jewish History Soundbites, bringing alive the world of our glorious past. Here is our host, live from Jerusalem, Jewish historian and tour guide, Yehuda Geberer.
Welcome, everyone, to Jewish History Soundbites. This is Yehuda Geberer with another episode of Jewish History Soundbites. And here we are with part 3 of Sisters of the Revolution, our ongoing series on girls' education in the modern era, Jewish education, formal Jewish education. And we left off in part 2, discussing the early attempts we talked about in Germany, and the opposition. We talked about the writing of the Chavetz Chaim, which gave the framework to allow teaching Torah to girls in modern times. And in that context, I want to mention a correction I received from no less an authority than Dr. Rachel Menachem herself. The one who wrote extensively on the topic, one of the greatest researchers around today of Galicia, Jewry and history, and she has written about Beis Yaakov and the founding of Beis Yaakov and in the context of the time, and she responded to the last episode. I had the privilege of receiving her response, and I'll want to read it, part of it to you. You might want to read the post that I posted at the Sfarim blog in regards to the Chavetz Chaim's heter about Torah education for girls. As we show there, the Chavetz Chaim's Likutei Halachos with the footnote on Torah education for girls was published in 1921 or 1922 and not 1911 as claimed by some. So if you go to that Sfarim blog post, then, which I suggest you do, you'll see how she and her husband established that how I had said, like many sources bring, that the Chavetz Chaim's writings had been published in 1911, which was before Beis Yaakov was founded, which is before World War I, which is before girls' education became a fact on the ground, when in fact she proves that it actually was a decade later. It was in 1921, earliest. And that means that the Chavetz Chaim was writing this footnote when girls' education was already a fact on the ground, was already an established reality, when Beis Yaakov was already several years old, when there were other girls' educational systems, as we'll see in today's episode, in Lithuania and in other parts of Poland. And in that context, the Chavetz Chaim was writing about how Torah study or Torah teaching for girls is permissible and actually a great mitzvah in modern times. So that's a very important correction, and it was a privilege to be able to correspond with her. Also, in the interim, in between part 2 and part 3, I was also had the privilege to be interviewed on another podcast, the Headlines podcast, by a very competent interviewer, Aaron Parnas. It was very enjoyable. And it was on this very topic. It was about the founding of Beis Yaakov and girls' education and the permissibility of teaching Torah to girls and the rabbinical opposition and later support for formal education. And we actually covered some of the topics that we're discussing in this series, so you might want to listen to that as well. The last thing that I want to mention in this context is sort of related, not directly, something else I do. I have, together with my writing colleague, Davi Safir, we write a history column for the Mishpacha magazine. And just last week, we mentioned something about Beis Yaakov. So it's kind of related to girls' education. And because it was Yom Kippur, we wanted more of a solemn, poignant, inspirational column in honor of the season. So we wrote about a newspaper reporting about a gathering in Chicago during World War II, during 1943, in memory of what was then believed to be the suicide or the martyrs of the 93 Beis Yaakov girls in Krakow who had chosen to take their own lives rather than be defiled by the Nazis. And there was a memorial gathering in their memory taking place in Chicago, and it was reported in the papers, and we discussed that. So I got a lot of response from it. I actually was nervous when we wrote it that the response that we would get would be that we're myth busting, where we called it a legend and we alleged that it wasn't true, the story, and yet there was this memorial gathering that in the collective memory of the United States Jewish community at the time, they did believe it. They could not verify the facts, obviously, in real time. It was a very chaotic situation during the Second World War, and communication wasn't that great. So I was nervous that we would get accused of myth busting and a holy legend like that. We don't want to be, especially Yom Kippur time, we don't want to be accused of myth busting. Instead, we got accused of the opposite. Apparently, many readers missed the word legend at the beginning or did not know how to define the word legend at the beginning of the column. And they said that we were passing off an untrue story as true. So we were not doing so, obviously, because first of all, we wrote that it was a legend. And take a look at any dictionary of what the word legend means, and it definitely does not mean a true story. And the second thing is that it's something that it's important in history in general, is that we're to discuss the process of how legends are accepted, and the focus was on the memorial gathering. The people at the time did believe it, and how did they react to it, and how was it reported in the news? And how did the Jewish community, the traditional Jewish community in the United States react to it? And what type of memorials did they do in these girls' memory? And the importance of how legends affect society is no less important than whether the story happened or not. It's a reality that it had a historical effect, and that's something that must be examined through the microscope of history. So that's definitely an important aspect of it. In addition to that is that if, again, I work in Yad Vashem, or at least before this pandemic started, when Yad Vashem was actually open and it was possible to work there. If the first thing about Nazi ideology, and once you get into the story of how the Nazis interacted with the Jews vis-a-vis their racial ideology, you know that the story couldn't have happened. Before you read any of these great articles out there disproving it, you don't need all that. If you know the slightest thing about Nazi racial ideology and how it was carried out in practice, a mass story like that could never have happened, and it's just too far-fetched to even imagine. But I think we'll get into that perhaps another time. What I want to get back to, I only mentioned it because it's related to Beis Yaakov and girls' education, but we already spent too much time on it. So let's get back to our primary focus here, where we talk about the pioneers of girls' education in Eastern Europe, and that all happens as a result of World War I. World War I brings the German army into Eastern Europe, the Austro-Hungarian army into certain parts of Eastern Europe, but primarily the the German army, and the German occupation, the civil occupation. The civil authorities start to organize life in all aspects in the areas that they begin to occupy, as a result of the not defeat, but the Russian army being pushed back deep into Russia, and therefore Germany now occupies all this area. So there are German rabbis that arrive on the scene together with the German army, some as chaplains, some as working for the German government. And the early girls' schools are a direct result of this presence of new German rabbis on the scene. How does that happen? So, given as an example, the Chavatzeles school in Warsaw. What happens is that there's two rabbis, Rabbi Doctors, who come along with the German occupation authorities. There's Rabbi Dr. Emmanuel Karl Bach and Rabbi Dr. Pinchos Kohn. The Pinchos Kohn was the Rav of Ansbach in Germany. Emmanuel Carlebach was the rabbi at that time. Earlier, he had been in Memel, which is Prussia, German held Prussia, but it's on the border of Lithuania. So there were a lot of Eastern European Jews there. He had an exposure, but at this time he was already the rabbi in Kohn, which is on the other side of Germany. So these two are community rabbis, but now they are they both have doctorates from German universities, and they are working for the German occupation army. Now, their influence on Polish Jewish life is decisive because they, way beyond Jewish education in general or girls' education specifically, because they're the ones who found the Agudas Yisrael in Poland. They're the ones in 1916 who they together they meet the Ger Rebbe and different representatives and different activists in Warsaw. They're based primarily in Warsaw. And they together they form and organize and establish Agudas Yisrael of Poland, which becomes the main center of Agudas Yisrael in the interwar period and the basis of Agudas Yisrael till today. So that's why Emmanuel Carlebach and Pinchos Kohn are so famous, because they're the ones who started Agudas Yisrael in Poland. Just kidding, they're not very famous at all, but it's a mystery because their role in history was very decisive. And they should be famous. So just a little bit about these people in general. Rav Pinchos Kohn continued even after World War I to be a major leader, one of the primary leaders of the world Agudas Yisrael, from his base in Germany and all three Knessia Gedolos of Agudas Yisrael in the interwar time. And then he escapes to Israel at the beginning of the war. And passes away shortly after the Second World War, and passes away shortly after. Emmanuel Carlebach, I'll be honest, I got a bit confused when looking into the Carlebachs, because I always get mixed up. It was such a huge family, and a huge rabbinic family primarily, and I just got mixed up. So I tried to organize it myself just to figure out what all the branches of the Carlebach family are, to see where Rabbi Emmanuel Carlebach fits in. So this is just giving you a basic background. So you have the original patriarch of the family is, lo and behold, Reb Shlomo Carlebach, who was a rabbi in Lübeck in Germany, and he has 12 children, 8 boys and 4 girls. And he has several sons who are in business, bankers, and so on. And he has several sons who are rabbis. One of them was the famous, for example, one of them was the famous Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Carlebach, who is going to come up in our story also, because he's involved in girls' education in Lithuania. But he becomes later famous as the rabbi in Hamburg, and he and his family are killed by the Nazis in Riga during the Holocaust. You have another son of his, who's Moshe Carlebach, who is also a businessman, but his grandson, his son went to study in the Mir Yeshiva, Naftali Carlebach, and his grandson is today Rabbi Yamin Carlebach, also of the Mir Yeshiva. You have another son, Reb David Carlebach, who passed away young, And then he had a son, Reb Naftali Carlebach, who was a rabbi in Berlin and later in New York City, and his son was the famous Shlomo Carlebach. But he had other sons. He had another son, interestingly, who was a banker, who was a rabbi. Another son who was a rabbi. Excuse me, I skipped him. Rabbi Ephraim Carlebach, who was a rabbi in Leipzig, and his son was a very interesting individual, Azriel Carlebach, who studied at the Telz Yeshiva and at I think the Mir Yeshiva also, if I'm not mistaken, and then left traditional Jewish life. He left religion completely, and he became a journalist and later embraced Zionism and later embraced Eastern European Jewish culture. And he was a reporter in Warsaw for a period of time, and he fell in love with Warsaw. There's this incredible, almost like a hesped, a eulogy that he gives for Jewish Warsaw after the war, which I personally love. I quote it sometimes when we're in Warsaw. And he talks about the Jewish cemetery and the Yiddish writers and Jewish culture and the Jewish communal life and the pulsing urban Jewish life of Warsaw and the interwar, which was completely wiped out later on. And Azriel Carlebach actually moves to Israel and becomes one of the head editors and writers for Yediot Achronot, gets into a fight with the editor of Yediot Achronot and leaves and becomes the founder and editor of Ma'ariv. So he was involved in Yediot Achronot and Ma'ariv. He was involved in other newspapers for a period of time also. In any event, we get back to the Carlebachs. One of the other sons of this Shlomo Carlebach was Rabbi Emmanuel Carlebach. By the way, he had his daughters, Shlomo Carlebach's daughters, went on to become pretty famous also. One of them married Leopold Rosenk, who was a rabbi, but became a patriarch of the Rosenk family, academic family of philosophers. And Avinoam Rosenk today, I've heard lectures from him, and he's a famous Jewish philosopher. One of the Karlbach daughters married a Kohn, whose son was Chaim Kohn, the Attorney General and later Supreme Court Justice in the State of Israel. Either way, you go on and on and on. It's a very prominent family, the Karlbach. So one of the sons is this Rabbi Emmanuel Carlebach, and he is he and Rabbi Pinchos Kohn, they are involved in the founding of the Chavatzeles schools for girls in Warsaw. By the way, when Emmanuel Carlebach goes back to Kohn after the war to his rabbinical position, he founds the school for girls, and he ironically calls it Yavneh, which we're going to see was also a school for girls in Lithuania at the time. In any event, so these two rabbis, they start, besides for starting Agudas Yisrael, they also start the modernization of Orthodox education in Poland. They needed a lot of reform, and they convinced the religious Jewish community in Warsaw that it needs reform, including the chassidic community, including the Ger Rebbe. And one of the things they started is the girls' school, Chavatzeles, and that eventually becomes a whole network of schools in Warsaw, near Warsaw. In fact, it becomes so prominent that the first Beis Yaakov, remember, this is not Beis Yaakov, this is Chavatzeles, this is a different organization. It started in 1916, before Beis Yaakov. But the first Beis Yaakov National Conference in Poland was held in 1925, I believe. We'll get to it. Where was it held? At Chavatzeles in Warsaw. And all the resolutions of Beis Yaakov are taken at this place, at this location. So they use this location to expand the Beis Yaakov movement. There was a prominent Chavatzeles school in Kalisz, in a very famous Jewish town in more west from Warsaw, from Lodz, and in other towns there. So it sprung around, it grew. There was quite a few students who attended these schools, and it was a successful movement. Another girls' school movement was started in Lithuania, the Yavneh school system. In Kovna and Telz, the yeshiva in Telz was heavily involved. The Telz Rav, Rabbi Yosef Leib Bloch, was very much involved. And eventually in Telz there was a teacher seminary and a high school. They used Hebrew as a language of instruction. You're talking at a time where Yiddish as a language of instruction was considered the socialists, the Bundists, the communists. They used Yiddish. To use Hebrew was either considered Zionist or very religious, because you used Hebrew, the holy language. So in Yavneh they used that. There was in other towns, and it had a lasting influence. I mean, until today, there's an influence of Yavneh both in name and of in structure. Now, how was that started? So you had, like I mentioned, Rabbi Yosef Tzvi Carlebach, who I mentioned as the rabbi of Hamburg. He's not yet the rabbi of Hamburg at this point. So he was involved in the founding. Now, it is known as, when he started it, he was known as the Karl Bach Gymnasium. And at first, the traditional elements of Lithuanian Jewish society would not want to send their kids to this in Kovna. He founded it in Kovna, in Lithuania during World War I. They wanted to send their kids to a German school, right? Remember, it's supervised by the German civil administration. And the rabbi of the school wears a German army uniform. So they're very skeptical about this school. So it's founded as a boys and girls schools in Kovna. And it has three lasting influences. This Rabbi Yosef Carlebach leaves with this school system three lasting influences on the Lithuanian traditional religious education of the interwar period. Number one, schools for girls. It had been unheard of before that. And now in Kovna, and later on we'll see in Telz and Panovich and other places, they have schools for girls. Also the idea of education reform, similar to what his brother was doing in Warsaw, convincing the Hasidim that they need to have education reform. So he was doing the same thing to the Litvaks in Lithuania, that they need to reform the cheder system. The old way doesn't work anymore. You need to do it. You need to just modernize it and refreshen it up. And the third thing he leaves them is Teirim Derech Eretz. The ideology of Teirim Derech Eretz has a lasting influence, much more than in Poland. It has a lasting influence, and especially as far as tells, Rabbi Yosef Leibloch very much appreciated certain aspects of the Teirim Derech Eretz ideology, and it was definitely incorporated into the educational system to a limited extent, not to the full extent, to the girls' schools more than in the boys' schools, but to a limited extent. The influence of German Jewry on Eastern European Jewish life, especially in the educational realm, cannot be underestimated. So the Telzer Rav, like I mentioned, together with another fellow, Dr. Leo Deutschlander, who we're also going to come back to as far as Beis Yaakov is concerned, eventually they found the Yavneh schools. Remember, the Yavneh schools are both boys' schools and girls' schools. They found close to 100 schools throughout Lithuania in the interwar period. That includes the teachers' seminaries and the large schools in the places like Telz and Panovich and Kovna, and it includes the elementary schools in the small towns, and of course it's including boys' schools and girls' schools. So you see that it was seen as one system. Dr. Deutschlander, Leo Deutschlander, who we're going to get back to because he's very involved in Beis Yaakov, and he's very involved in Agudas Yisrael and the Karen HaTorah and the fundraising. So he's serving as a liaison between the German occupational government during World War I and the Lithuanian Jewish communities. And he's involved in the founding of the Kovna school and in expanding it. And that included these girls' schools as well. If we go specifically to the one in Telz, so many of the classes were in Hebrew, like I mentioned, in the high school, which was established in 1921, and it was famous all over Lithuania because it had a very strong religious education and it had a very high standard of general studies. You have to remember that it was recognized by the Lithuanian government. It was accredited, like Beis Yaakov would be, like Chavatzeles was in Warsaw. All these schools wanted to be approved by the governments, and therefore they incorporated whatever was required for general studies. Many rabbis and Orthodox Jews around the whole Zamush area of Lithuania sent their daughters to the high school, to this elite Yavneh high school in Telz or in Kovna, and it became a very popular, very successful school. They graduated classes from the school, from the teacher seminary, and it lasted until the Soviet occupation at the beginning of the Second World War, where they disbanded all religious schools. But this Yavneh chain was supervised it was considered very much not belonging, but supervised by Telz, in the Telz Yeshiva, and the Telz Rav Rebbeisif Lehman, later on by his son, Rav Yitzchak Blach. And in fact, when we go to Panovich on the tours of Lithuania, we go to visit the town of Panovich, and what's today considered the Jewish Community Center. There's not really that many Jews in Panovich, but it is a Jewish community center where we always visit, and there's someone who shows us around, and we sign the book there, and it's a whole, we see a video, and it's a whole part of our day when we go to Panovich. So the Jewish Community Center today was the girls' school. It was part of the Yavneh system. I think it might have even been called Beis Yaakov, ironic. You have to, it was in Lithuania. It wasn't exactly part of the Beis Yaakov system of Sarah Schenirer, but I have to double check that. I think it might have even been called Beis Yaakov in Panovich, but it was definitely part of the Yavneh school system. And the Panovich Rav, Rabbi Shlomo Kahneman, was heavily involved in that school. Interestingly enough, with the name Yavneh, it was a popular name for schools at the time. I mentioned that Rabbi Emmanuel Karl Bach himself, his school was Chavatzeles, but when he went back to Kohn and he started a girls' school, he called it Yavneh, right? And then you have these Yavneh schools in Lithuania, which are affiliated with Telz, which was started by these German rabbis and activists. But then you have another school system called Yavneh in Poland, not in Lithuania. And that Yavneh is affiliated with the Mizrahi. It's part of their Tachkemoni school system. And that was also for boys and for girls in interwar Poland. Separate schools, boys' schools, girls' schools. And they had their rabbinical school Tachkemoni in Warsaw. And they have these Yavneh Tachkemoni schools throughout Poland. I remember hearing Reb Aaron Leib Steinman describing how the Tachkemoni school in Brisk, where he grew up, was considered the elite school. But he wasn't an elitist, and neither was his father, so he went to the simple cheder in the school. He said it wasn't as good, the learning wasn't as good as the Tachkemoni school, but he still went to the simple cheder, and I think he turned out all right anyway. But the Yavneh schools of the Mizrahi were, again, it's religious schools for both boys and girls, and it's Zionistic. They used Hebrew as a major language, not exclusively. They also used Polish and Yiddish, like the Agudas Yisrael schools, Chorev and the other Agudas Yisrael schools. They didn't exclusively use Hebrew, but it was a big emphasis. Zionism and everything. So you have these school systems starting independently, again, of Beis Yaakov. I mentioned recently in a Borough Park episode that there was a girls' school, a religious Orthodox girls' school started in Borough Park in 1930 called Shalamis. Now, 1930 is way after Beis Yaakov starts, but again, you see that there are girls' schools starting in the traditional elements of society, independent of the Beis Yaakov name. So here we finally get to the founding of Beis Yaakov itself. And we come to Sarah Schenirer, the personality of Sarah Schenirer. And the reason that she goes down in history, despite the fact that everyone else is also founding schools at this time, is because, first of all, her success went beyond anyone's. I mean, the spread of the movement, it actually became a movement. It's hard to call any of these other school systems a movement. They might have been schools, individual schools, or even a school system, but it was far from a movement. The second aspect of it is that she was a woman who founded it independently before Agudas Yisrael threw their backing behind her, which took a couple of years in the infrastructure. And she was a woman operating in chassidic Galicia, in against all odds, on the fringes of traditional society, and she went ahead and did it. And also the lasting influence, of course, of Beis Yaakov, which puts her in a very prominent place in Jewish history. So where does her story begin? So she grows up in a Hasidic home. The family was Belzer Hasidim in Krakow, and she was a very bright individual. She was self-taught in many ways. She was well-read and very well-versed in many secular general subjects and knowledge, and very intellectually curious. She loved nature, she loved the outdoors, she loved traveling. She kept a diary, so we actually know quite a bit of her inner world from her own writings. Unlike many other historical figures, we don't have to conjecture or make up stories. We can actually know what she was thinking and what her feelings were and her ideology and her outlook was because of her own writings. So she gets married, and it was a lousy marriage. She got divorced. She didn't like the marriage. Seems that she was more religious than her husband, and she didn't want to compromise on those religious beliefs. She was definitely very deeply religious, and it was of utmost importance to her religious life throughout her life. And so she's now single, and World War I breaks out, and she goes, like many Galicia Jews, she flees as a refugee to Vienna. And there she's exposed to, what's ironic about all the stories we've been saying until now is the influence of German Jews on Eastern European Jews. We have the founding of all these schools is by German Jewish rabbis. And here, Sarah Schenirer, we finally have one she wasn't a German Jewish rabbi. It's not the influence of Jews. She's from a chassidic home. She's a Galicia Jew. This is our own. We don't need any yucky help over here. It turns out that over here also was with yucky help because the German Jewish influence had a decisive influence on Sarah Scheniner's life direction, because in several stages and in many ways. Number one is because she's exposed in Vienna. She meets up. She goes to shul. She wants to daven in shul. And she happens to attend the shul of a fascinating individual named Rabbi Dr. Moshe David Flesch, who was a student of Rabbi Dr. Shlomo Breuer, Solomon Breuer, the son-in-law of Rav Hirsch, and the one who took his place in Frankfurt as the rabbi of the separatist Orthodox community in Frankfurt, and a follower, therefore, of the Hirschian ideology of Torah Derech Eretz. And he's addressing he's speaking from the pulpit. And first of all, he's speaking in the vernacular. He's speaking in German, and which was, how can you speak in the vernacular, not speaking in Yiddish? And he is also addressing the women in the crowd. It was Hanukkah, and he's talking about one of the women heroes of Hanukkah, I think Yehudis or whatever it was, and he's addressing the role of women, which was also unheard of in Galicia. The rabbis in Galicia, if they were articulate altogether, they might speak about women to their husbands or fathers, but not to. They would not address women directly and speak about their role and their importance. And she was very inspired, and she goes to speak to him. And he introduces her to the world of German Orthodoxy, Neo-Orthodoxy. And he introduces her to this forum of Reb Shamshon Raphael Hirsch, Chorev, and the 19 letters, which becomes basically the Bible of the Beis Yaakov movement. The Beis Yaakov movement curriculum was based very much on the writings of Rav Hirsch in the interwar period, and was heavily influenced by the German Orthodox ideology and outlook, in the fact also that they brought in educators from Germany, like Dr. Judith Grunfeld, eventually Grunfeld. She was something else, Grunbaum, something like that, before she was married, and Dr. Leo Deutschlander and others, and very much influenced in curriculum and in their outlook by German Orthodoxy. So we'll stop here for part 3. In part 4, we're going to focus almost exclusively on Beis Yaakov and discuss how the movement was started, how it developed, and how it expanded and grew exponentially into a mass movement during the interwar Poland. So this was Yehudi Geber with Jewish History Soundbites. You can reach me at yehuda@yehudageber.com for questions, comments, sources, tours, trips, lectures, and sponsorships, virtual tours, and especially now, Sukkot is coming up. If you want to be entertained with a virtual tour or a history lecture, or if you'd like to sponsor an episode of Jewish History Soundbites, please be in touch with me. And you can subscribe to Jewish History Soundbites on Podbean or on your favorite podcast platform. Follow us on Twitter at JSoundbites, and I hope you enjoyed.